Nuclear disarmament has been in the news lately, so I've partnered with Ground News, an app and website that helps you develop better news habits and get a more honest view of the world. Ground News gathers articles from over 50,000 sources, so you can compare how different outlets are reporting the same story. It can detect a source's political bias, reliability, and even their financial backing, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. So you can trust that Ground News itself isn't just another thing you need to decode. Go to ground.news/horses to see the full coverage on Trump's latest nuclear disarmament talks with China and Russia. Some frame his proposed defense budget cuts as a bold move towards diplomacy, while others warn it could weaken national security. On Ground News, you can see which outlets are pushing each narrative, their biases, and who owns them. Ground News' ownership tool is my personal favorite. Giant media conglomerates control the news and shape the world, usually with profit in mind. So this tool distinguishes whether a narrative is being pushed by corporations, the government, or more independent voices. And because certain topics often circulate in echo chambers, Ground News created their blind spot feed to show what stories are getting attention exclusively from right or left-leaning news sources. Even if you don't agree with the other side, it is important to get a well-rounded sense of cultural discourse. I like Ground News because it doesn't push you stories based on algorithms. Major news outlets try to farm outrage and get clicks so they can sell ad space. But Ground News is funded by subscribers, so there are no ads anywhere on the platform. I personally have been using Ground News, and I sincerely think it's a great product. Go to ground.news/horses to get 40% off the same all-access Vantage plan that I use, knocking the cost down to $5 a month. The media landscape is more chaotic than ever, so if you want an honest perspective on what's happening in the world, click the link in my description or scan my QR code to start using Ground News today. Since World War II, humanity has carried with it a new and tremendous burden. It is one which looms in the background and weighs with an invisible force on our world. With the development of the nuclear bomb, humankind now has a push button for our own annihilation. Like some dark and open secret, nuclear war is a topic that leaders and citizens do not like to discuss. For good reason. It is the ultimate topic. It is the end of all things, and it is only a button away. It may be no exaggeration to say this is the most profoundly important topic of our times, so it deserves conversation. What happens when such a bomb drops? What happens to humans in the blast range and to society immediately and in the longer future? How could nuclear war come about? Are we really as safe from this ultimate as we would like to believe? In this essay, I will answer all of these questions and many more. In a moment, we will discuss the consequences of a nuclear strike on humans, structures, and the planet. But before we do so, we should get a base understanding of how nuclear weapons work. There are many different types of nuclear bombs, in a wide variety of sizes and formats and capabilities, but they all share the same basic functionality, that is, a rapid release of explosive energy through fission, or the splitting of an atom. Striking an atom with a neutron can split that atom, but it also creates a chain reaction. The split atom releases neutrons which split 2, then 4, then 8, and so on other atoms around it. Within a millisecond, a nuclear detonation can create trillions or septillions or more of these splits, which instantly release an unfathomable amount of energy. There also exist nuclear bombs which use fission and fusion in tandem, often known as hydrogen or thermonuclear bombs. These use hydrogen to create nuclear fusion, which causes even more fission events than a traditional nuclear weapon. More fission events means a larger explosion. Certainly this is a grossly simplified explanation of a nuclear weapon, but it will suffice. The point of this video is not, in fact, these mechanics, but instead their effects. Nuclear bombs produce thousands, sometimes millions times more energy than a typical explosive. They do so in a much smaller format. A nuclear bomb with the same energy of a traditional explosive will be exponentially smaller than its counterpart. The temperatures achieved through a nuclear explosion are profoundly higher than a conventional bomb, with much of the energy being emitted as pure heat and light. Nuclear bombs are also accompanied by invisible radiation, which has both immediate and long-term effects. In a nuclear scenario, it is also tremendously unlikely that one single bomb would be deployed. For one matter, a nuclear attack would usually bring nuclear retaliation. Additionally, as a bomb is made bigger, its destructive radius does not increase equally. In fact, it is more effective to deploy hundreds or thousands of smaller weapons in the context of a nuclear war. So if one such weapon is used, thousands more will likely follow in the initial assault and proceeding retaliations. For the purposes of this video, we will assume such a scenario has occurred, a full-on nuclear war. Nuclear destruction is a field which has been tremendously well studied. In fact, the United States Department of Defense has released a piece of scientific literature called The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, which remains as the most authoritative work published on the topic. That will be the main source for the information relayed in this video. Now, with all of that out of the way, what happens when the bombs go off? A nuclear bomb detonates at a temperature of 180 million degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 5 times hotter than the core of the sun. This detonation releases, before anything else, a silent flash of light. Anyone who is looking directly at this flash of light within up to a 15-mile radius will become instantly blinded. For the lucky, this may be temporary flash blinding, but this alone will cause havoc, destruction, and death. For example, those driving cars will careen off the road or into other drivers, and there will be automobile accidents en masse. Others who witness the flash will experience severe burns to their retinas, which will never heal. The flash of light itself is so hot that it will also ignite and melt away the skin of any humans in the immediate blast radius. Immediately following this flash of light, there is a loud explosion of compressed air, which travels faster than the speed of sound, taking the form of a fireball. Observers even 50 miles away would see this fireball as brighter than the sun at noon. This blast creates catastrophic damage. It levels all man-made structures and rips apart any humans within its range. Those who suffer injuries rather than death will be sorted into 2 categories: direct injuries and indirect injuries. Direct injuries are the result of contact with the blast wave. In these injuries, the body would be engulfed in heat and then subjected to intense compression. Eardrums may rupture immediately. The thorax and abdominal walls of the individual implode, causing hemorrhages and ruptures to vital organs. Air may reach the veins in the lungs, causing an embolism as the blood's pathways fill with air bubbles. As terrible as these things are, they will not cause death in all cases. Instead, indirect injuries become much more lethal. Indirect injuries are those caused by flying debris like concrete, glass, or other hard structures. These fractured materials will fly through the air like missiles. Glass will shred through human flesh. Larger objects will crush and impale bystanders. The physical body may also be displaced, thrown into the air, resulting in an indirect injury when it impacts a surface. Because the body has been tremendously weakened by direct injuries, it is no longer able to recover from the physical traumas of these indirect injuries. Even minor wounds will be lethal. Following the blast wave, the bomb will produce outbound winds up to 300 miles per hour. This is about double the wind speed of a Category 5 hurricane. It is significantly faster than the highest wind speed ever recorded on Earth. Any structures which have survived the initial blast will be torn apart by these winds. Humans will be thrown into the air and suffer indirect injuries upon impact with a hard surface. As the mushroom cloud begins to form, it floats into the sky at over 200 miles per hour. This creates a suction, and the bomb's winds reverse direction towards the explosion. Humans are swept into the air and sucked into the bomb's cloud, which is increasingly comprised of cars, concrete, debris, and dead bodies. All of these are incinerated as they enter into the bomb's hot center. All of this heat and wind has another immediate effect: fires, massive fires larger than humanity has ever witnessed. From the sheer heat produced by the bomb, hundreds of square miles will ignite immediately. Gas lines explode, spraying fire into the air and across the land. Chemicals, man-made materials, and plastics all burn and release toxic gases into the air. Birds and planes catch on fire and drop from the skies, igniting new fires. 100+ mile-per-hour winds distribute these fires across massive amounts of land, and the affected area burns without the possibility of containment. Any surviving people in the blast range ignite and are burned alive. Those on the outskirts of the immediate blast area will suffer from 1st to 3rd degree burns. These injuries will cover the entire body, causing swelling around the eyes and immobility at the elbows, knees, hands, and feet. These people will not be able to move, and they will likely be crushed, impaled, or burned alive. Carbon dioxide from these fires will be sucked into subway tunnels, chimneys, and open windows or gaps in housing structures. Those who have taken shelter in these places asphyxiate, vomit, and convulse until they die. Depending on the scope of the bombs, tens or hundreds of millions will die due to the above factors. There will be very few injuries because those who are injured will likely die from compounding wounds and lack of medical care. But those who die from the immediate detonation may be considered the lucky ones. Nuclear bombs, of course, carry a litany of delayed effects. As the bomb's cloud forms and dissipates, it rains enormous amounts of radioactive material onto the land. The contaminants in this nuclear hailstorm will have a number of destructive effects. The first is radiation. Radioactive materials from the bomb will land on the skin of individuals or travel through body openings into the interior of humans. Radiation poisoning from a nuclear bomb can be separated into 2 distinct types: acute and chronic. Acute radiation represents the immediate effects of exposure to radioactive material. Chronic, on the other hand, describes the more long-term consequences of such an incident. Those within the most affected zones, if they survive, will suffer from acute radiation sickness. Limbs will begin to swell arbitrarily. The individual will then experience explosive diarrhea and vomiting until their bowels are entirely evacuated. After this, the diarrhea and vomiting will continue, and watery liquid will fall freely from the mouth and the anus. A similar watery fluid may seep from the pores of the skin and form painful blisters which will rupture with any movement of the body. In a matter of hours, the body will then lose its ability to oxygenate blood, turning the skin a blue color. Purple patches of skin will appear across the entire body and inside of the mouth before these patches split open and begin to bleed profusely. Within days, the hair falls out in large chunks. The individual's bone marrow will begin to die. Large clots will prevent blood from circulating through the system. This causes necrosis of the limbs, and each extremity individually begins to blacken and die. The protective barrier around the intestinal tract breaks down, releasing toxic bacteria into neighboring vital organs. The body by this time has lost its ability to fight off these sorts of toxic materials, so the kidneys and other major organs fail. The circulatory system collapses in on itself. The tissue which separates organs from one another dies and dissolves completely, causing the organs to merge into one mass. After a week of unimaginable and untreatable pain, the radiated individual is dead. If a coroner were to autopsy such a body, they would find a cadaver full of rotten, liquefied organs and blood which has been unable to coagulate. Some individuals may receive non-lethal doses of acute radiation poisoning. This will cause necrosis, bone tumors, and quickly growing deformities. Radioactive chemicals also destroy the body's ability to fight infection, so minor ailments, including those which will be caused by the radiation itself, become lethal. The body loses its ability to form blood clots, resulting in mass hemorrhages and internal bleeding. Ulcers may form on the intestinal linings of survivors. Persons with less severe acute radiation poisoning may not experience these symptoms. Instead, they will suffer from the long-lasting symptoms of chronic radiation poisoning. Exposure to radiation fundamentally changes the cells and the tissues of the body in a way which is irreparable and catastrophic. Within weeks or months, individuals may form cataracts over their eyes, which can lead to permanent and complete blindness. Chronic radiation poisoning also causes leukemia, with an onset anywhere from 1 to 20 years after exposure. The thyroid is particularly susceptible to radiation poisoning, so exposed individuals can expect thyroid cancer later in life. Lung, intestinal, and breast cancer are also common results of even small-dose radiation poisoning. Even if the individual does not develop any of these cancers, there is a general life shortening which appears in exposed people. As mentioned, after being radiated, the body permanently loses its ability to fight infection and repair damaged tissues. This will cut years or decades off a person's expected lifespan. Surviving men may become sterile. If an exposed woman wishes to bear children, she is at an exponentially increased risk for stillbirths and first-year infant death. Among surviving infants, there will be a massively increased rate of mental disabilities. The head circumferences of these children will be markedly smaller than normal. Resulting from the corrupted roots in gums, children may fail to develop their teeth or experience other orthodontic deformities. When we discuss direct and indirect injuries from the blast, acute and chronic radiation poisoning, there is one more thing we must consider. Virtually no affected individuals near the blast zone will suffer from just one of these maladies. More likely, survivors will experience a combination of several physical injuries and radiation-borne illnesses. Furthermore, survivors will not receive any medical treatment. Medical facilities will be destroyed or overloaded. Due to massive amounts of radiation, firestorms, and wind, it is unwise, deadly, and impossible to travel into affected blast areas. There can be no help for the survivors of a nuclear strike. The entire death toll would change greatly based on where a bomb was detonated. Immediate deaths could range in the tens or hundreds of millions, but this number will balloon into the billions as we examine the next leg of the incident, that is, nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is a theory, and that is a qualifier we will discuss momentarily. But for now, we can say that a nuclear winter begins most primarily with the bomb's megafires. When people die in burning buildings, they most often die from smoke inhalation. In many cases, this is because they are breathing poison. When man-made objects burn, they have a remarkable tendency to create toxic fumes. For example, a single wool business suit, when ignited, produces enough cyanide to kill 7 people. Fire, depending on what burns, produces a number of toxins including carbon monoxide, hydrogen chloride, vinyl chloride, and more. Zyklon B was the nerve agent used in Nazi death camps. But Zyklon B is merely the brand name for hydrogen cyanide, one of the most common gases made by burning synthetic, man-made material. In the Vietnam War, the United States used a gas called Agent Orange to horrifying effect. Agent Orange encourages the development of numerous cancers, including lymphomas, sarcoma, and leukemia. It also produces stillbirths and birth defects like clubfoot, fused digits, muscle malformations, paralysis, and other developmental disabilities. Agent Orange is what's known as a dioxin, which is commonly produced in the burning of insulations, plastics, and trash. Electrical transformers, for example, are full of dangerous chemicals which become dioxins like Agent Orange when burned. Many hazardous chemicals like chlorine, ammonia, sulfuric acid, and phosphoric acid are stored in massive quantities which measure in the millions of tons. A nearby nuclear explosion and the resulting fire will disperse these toxins into the air, water, and land. Oil refineries will ignite, spraying sulfuric acid into the air, acidifying clouds and rainfall. These toxins will be spread by the bomb's hurricane-force winds, affecting people and lands far, far outside of the initial blast area. Furthermore, the lack of firefighting ability means these things burn until all flammable material is consumed and pushed into the air. So to begin a nuclear winter, the Earth itself, its rains, water, land, and even air, is essentially made poisonous. As thousands of square miles burn, these fires create a massive amount of dark, toxic soot. This will rise into the Earth's atmosphere, where it will entirely block out the sun. Depending on location, the Earth's temperature could drop by as much as 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In most of the United States, Canada, and Europe, the temperature will remain below freezing for 6 years. Days will be as dark as nights. The Earth enters into nuclear winter, or perhaps more accurately, a nuclear ice age. Sources of fresh water freeze. Those lakes which have not frozen are contaminated by chemical waste, dead bodies, and detritus from the fallout. Safeguards for toxic chemicals have been destroyed, and hazardous waste has contaminated all of the oceans. Toxins leach into the sea, and the beaches are covered in dead sea creatures. The lack of sunlight disrupts plants' ability to photosynthesize, destroying the food chain, and our ecosystems crumble from the bottom up. A mass extinction begins. Crops and farm animals die of freeze, starvation, or thirst. Food stores are destroyed, burned, toxified, or irradiated. The firestorms have superheated and irradiated all of the Earth's soil. Farming is impossible. Billions of humans die from starvation and thirst. But months later, the cloud of smog begins to dissipate. The sun shines on Earth again. However, now the radioactive cloud has destroyed Earth's ozone layer, which in the past protected humans from dangerous ultraviolet sun rays. Without this sort of filtration, the sunlight is now poisonous. Any survivors can only live underground. Insects are less susceptible to radiation, and their natural predators are now virtually extinct. So bugs begin to thrive and overpopulate the planet. Many species find their way into underground shelters, spreading insect-borne diseases including typhus, malaria, and Lyme disease. All healthcare systems have collapsed, so these diseases run untreated and uncontained. The future of humanity, even on the longest of timelines, is uncertain. The above scenario makes for salacious storytelling, but we must be truthful. Nuclear winter is only a theory. Indeed, when it was first published, nuclear winter was regarded as Soviet propaganda. This propaganda notion has been largely discredited. Nuclear winter is real, but we don't know to what extent. Recent studies conflict with one another. Some say that the reality would be much worse than previously thought, while others indicate the nuclear winter phenomenon is largely overblown. The issue here is that research and theorizing on nuclear winter is predicated on a huge number of variables. Where do the bombs drop? What kind of nuclear bombs are they? What are the area's structures built from? What are the weather patterns at time of detonation? The questions go on infinitely. Because of the endless amount of conjecture involved, it is extremely difficult to predict the particulars of a nuclear winter. But it is not a theory I think any of us wish to test. For the entirety of this essay, I have been dancing around a subject. There has been an elephant in this room which hitherto has gone unaddressed. For much of the writing process, I was hesitant to address it. I worry about exploiting the suffering of a people for the sake of contemporary media. However, I worry more greatly about the disservice done in ignoring a suffering so relevant. Nuclear strikes are not just hypothetical. They have been real, and their devastation has been actual. To conclude World War II, the American President Harry S. Truman dropped 2 nuclear weapons on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Debate rages on about the necessity and morality of this decision, but certainly there is no debate to the effects on the millions of civilians in these cities. I think the best and most honest way to portray the suffering of these people is through their own words. In 1981, the Japan Broadcasting Corporation published a book called The Unforgettable Fire. This book is a compilation of drawings and accounts by Japanese survivors in and around Hiroshima. What follows is a number of selections from the book, arranged to create a timeline of the bombing. Tsutomu Ojiri. I saw the explosion about 10 miles away when I was 5 years old. This is the way I remembered the explosion in the 5 seconds before the sound reached me. Koi Nakamachi. Everything was instantly covered with pink and blue light rays. There was a strange whooshing sound, and then the black rain came down. Hidehiko Okazaki. I had a view of Hijiyama from the Hijiyama Elementary School. Going out of an air raid shelter, I could see the mushroom cloud beyond the mountain. The top was narrower than below, but it was getting bigger as I watched. I wondered what the red smoke was. Setsuko Yamamoto. I smelled and tasted the black rain on my hand. Parents were looking for their children, and children were crying for their parents. Houses along the street were burning. I went down to the river from the back gate and washed my hands and feet and dampened my clothes for the next air raid. In the excitement, I urinated in my clothes and then washed them. There were countless people on the riverbank. Name withheld by request. The vice principal who came into the classroom immediately after the A-bomb had lost his glasses. His clothes were torn off, and his arms, bloody and skinned, hung down by his side. His face was burned black. Suddenly, there was an unusual blue light. It was hot and painful. Numerous pieces of glass scattered and attacked me on my head, face, and back. When I stood up and took a few steps towards the entrance, I was pushed from behind by a strong force and fell down by the doorway. Tomoko Kanishi. A girl was standing in the middle of the road, staring vacantly. Strange to say, her clothes were not tattered. She was 8 years old. The wound on her head looked like a cracked pomegranate. Silently, I carried her on my back and headed in the direction of the Ota River. Then I heard a girl's voice clearly from behind a tree. "Help me, please." Her back was completely burned, and the skin peeled off and was hanging down from her hips. Name unknown. A mother, driven half-mad while looking for her child, was calling his name. At last she found him. His head looked like a boiled octopus. His eyes were half closed, and his mouth was white, pursed, and swollen. Kinzo Nishida. While taking my severely wounded wife out to the riverbank by the side of the hill of Nakahiromachi, I was horrified, indeed, at the sight of a stark, naked man standing in the rain with his eyeball in his palm. He looked to be in great pain, but there was nothing that I could do for him. Terumi Nishida. A woman with her jaw missing and her tongue hanging out of her mouth was wandering around the area of Shinsho-machi in the heavy black rain. She was heading towards the north, crying for help. I wonder if she survived. Suemi Kajia. The mother's entire back was burned, but her front was not injured. Her breasts especially appeared normal, so that her baby was clinging to them to suckle. The baby was strong and moved from his mother's breasts to the ground and back again. She was unconscious. Kazuo Matsumuro. Takeya section, 8 kilometers from the hypocenter, in search of a place to cremate her dead child. The burned face of the child on her back was infested with maggots. I guess she was thinking of putting her child's bones in the battle helmet she had picked up. Kiyoaki Ueno. I was a freshman at the Hiroshima Teacher Training School. After the A-bomb dropped, I helped in the cleanup and reorganization of the Hiroshima Teacher Training School in Shinonome town. Since there was no medicine, one of the rescue party was coating a survivor's burns in mercurochrome, another coated it with cooking oil, and the third person pasted newspaper over it. I cannot forget the victim's cries at the time the paper was being torn off. As there were a lot of flies, maggots were crawling in the wounds. Yoshimihara. After a few days, we carried the injured people who had been on Kanawa Island to the Otake Marine Corps base. We could do nothing for the injured people but give them water. A girl spurted blood from her artery when her pressure bandage was taken off. There was a man whose face looked like a broken watermelon whenever he moved his mouth. We set sail at 5 in the morning. Suddenly, an enemy plane flew towards us and shot at us with machine guns. We could do nothing but put blankets over the people. During the attack, 2 of the 50 people were killed. One was a man of 50 who got up, crawled a few feet while calling for his wife, and then died. The other of the 2 was a girl with her family near her. Yoshio Takahara. After 1 month in bed, I managed to walk again, and so I rejoined my military unit. Within a week, all of my comrades' hair turned a red-brown color and fell out. They were also bleeding from the gums and under the nails. Gradually, they became emaciated, and their burns festered all over. It looked like they were carrying bags of water on their backs. They all soon died. Otochi Yamamoto. Every year, August 6th, I remember the time of the A-bomb explosion. I can never forget the terror and horror of the atomic bomb. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States military conducted 67 nuclear weapons tests in the South Pacific, mostly on the Marshall Islands. Of these, the most significant was undoubtedly one called Castle Bravo. This remains the largest nuclear test ever conducted by the United States. The Castle Bravo test occurred on a small island called Bikini Atoll. The U.S. military chose the Marshall Islands because of their remote location. In a distinctly imperialist move, the Americans did not really offer the locals any say in the matter. U.S. Navy Commodore Ben Wyatt met with Bikini Atoll inhabitants and leadership on a Sunday after their church services, ostensibly to ask permission. But a month prior, Harry Truman had already approved Bikini Atoll as a testing site for the operation. In any case, the island's leader granted permission to Wyatt, and the operation began. The military relocated 167 Bikinians to nearby Rongerik Atoll. The island lacked food supplies and potable water. In the wake of some international controversy, the U.S. also insisted that the plans were scientific rather than for the sake or implication of military operations. The Castle Bravo test was conducted on March 1st. American engineers predicted the explosion would be about 5 megatons. When detonated, it measured around 15. The mushroom cloud rose 130,000 feet into the air and spread over an area of 25 miles in just 10 minutes. In addition to Bikini Atoll, the explosion incinerated 2 other nearby islands. Researchers also claimed the fallout would travel less than 15 miles. In fact, it spanned in total closer to 200 miles, contaminating a number of nearby islands. Fallout rained over the area, comprised of crushed coral, water, and radioactive particles. Having no concept of nuclear weapons or their dangers, the Marshallese children played with the falling snow, and women rubbed particles into their hair. A U.S. report claimed that there would be no long-term effects on the native people. The report said that the locals had been evacuated, were provided with better housing and resources on their new island, where they now lived quite happily. In reality, the Marshallese had been exposed to near-fatal levels of radiation. Roentgen equivalent man, or REM, is a unit of measurement for radiation dosage. 50 rem typically poisons the blood and causes genetic problems. 100 rem begins acute radiation sickness and can cause various types of cancer. The Marshallese were exposed to doses often closer to 300 rem. The affected natives were immediately made the subject of a U.S. research program. But the American scientists did not ask for consent or explain to the Marshallese what the program was. Marshallese natives were shuttled between islands and sometimes flown to laboratories in the United States. The Americans generally did not provide translators during tests or explain the nature of the individual tests. Marshallese were told they were being treated for vague illnesses and were made to take unmarked pills with no explanation. Shortly after the test, exposed pregnant women gave birth to severely deformed children. Some had abnormally large heads, others were born with translucent skin. All of these children died days after birth. As tests carried on, thousands of natives were forcibly displaced, often to islands which could not sustain such instant population growth. Many Marshallese suffered from severe malnutrition and starvation. Decades after the testing, the Marshallese continued to show abnormally high rates of birth defects and deformities. Thyroid tumors became commonplace. Cancer rates skyrocketed. Certainly many of these issues are to be blamed on American misconduct rather than the effects of nuclear bombs themselves. But we should not think this lessens the issue of nuclear proliferation. Quite the opposite. The production, testing, and use of these weapons brings a spiderweb of unforeseen consequences, even if the weapons are not deployed in an act of war. And certainly this brings to mind another reality. There are a number of situations outside of wartime which could produce a nuclear strike. So, how safe are we really? Conventional wisdom dictates that nuclear war is extremely unlikely. Many countries do have nuclear weapons. In fact, there are about 12,000 nuclear bombs in existence today. But these countries are led, it seems, by rational and non-suicidal people. These countries also have policies and safeguards which are intended to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. However, the fact remains that these weapons exist, and more countries are continuing to join the ranks of nuclear armadas. These weapons are now more destructive than ever. Those bombs dropped in Japan were very small in terms of nuclear arms. Additionally, nuclear threats seem increasingly common within international discourse, whether thinly veiled or otherwise. The risk of all-out nuclear Armageddon is not zero. Indeed, there are many scenarios which could see the deployment of these weapons, not all of which are the wartime situation we would immediately consider. The most popular and prevailing argument for nuclear proliferation rests on a doctrine called Mutually Assured Destruction, or MAD. According to MAD, two countries having nuclear capabilities minimizes the risk of nuclear war because of simple risk aversion. If country A strikes country B will retaliate. Both nations will be destroyed by one another, so neither is likely to deploy nuclear weapons. In fact, this idea far predates the invention of the atom bomb. In 1870, English author Wilkie Collins wrote the following: "I begin to believe in only one civilizing influence, the discovery one of these days of a destructive agent so terrible that war shall mean annihilation and men's fears will force them to keep the peace." Before World War II, Nikola Tesla theorized about a, quote, super weapon that would put an end to all war. In World War II and the following years, the United States was, of course, perfectly happy to have a monopoly on nuclear arms. But other countries quickly began developing their own nuclear programs, and in 1962, President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, made MAD a centerpiece for the U.S. nuclear strategy. Although MAD is today seen as the first and foremost argument in favor of nuclear arms, the doctrine has never been unanimously accepted. In the Cold War, some Soviets believed they could survive a nuclear attack, that MAD didn't really apply in practice. U.S. presidents have landed on either side of the debate. Whether or not the U.S. or other nuclear powers officially endorse MAD today is a matter of interpretation. In practice, we could certainly say MAD has been effective. There has not been a world war since the invention of the nuclear bomb. Wars today are less deadly than they were in the past. However, I'm not sure the entirety of this can be credited to MAD. Additionally, the doctrine is an imperfect idea, and there exist many nuclear scenarios which it does not protect against. For one thing, MAD inherently leads to the proliferation of nuclear capability. It could be reasonably argued that the more nuclear weapons we have, the more likely one will be detonated, intentionally or otherwise. MAD also rests upon the idea of a second strike. For the doctrine to work, two things must be true. An attacking nation must not be able to destroy another nation in a way that eliminates that nation's ability to retaliate, to perform a second strike. Additionally, an attacked nation must guarantee that they can survive a first strike in a way that allows them to retaliate. As the list of countries with nuclear capabilities continues to grow, it becomes increasingly difficult to guarantee second strike capability. There is also assumed rationality. While conventional political science dictates that states are led by rational individuals who value the existence of their country above all other concerns, this isn't necessarily true. Some leaders may be propelled by ideological goals which are well outside the scope of their nation. In the past, countries have elected leaders who held extremist views which prioritized ideology above nation. It is reasonable to assume that this may happen again, and it may occur in a nuclear state. In another case, the leader of a nuclear state could be suffering defeat in a major conflict and may conclude that he or she simply has nothing left to lose. Additionally, countries may not make blatant nuclear threats, but instead choose to issue declarations which are vague enough to be interpreted as such. Through this sort of rhetoric, international crises can heighten in tension and quickly spiral out of control. This can be seen in the Cuban Missile Crisis, during which the Soviet Union placed nuclear weapons on Cuba in a threat to the United States. Then President Kennedy believed the risk of nuclear war to be between 33 and 50%. In this sort of situation, we basically have itchy trigger fingers. There emerges the significant possibility of accidental or inadvertent nuclear deployment. Accidents happen, and that includes the realm of nuclear weaponry. Indeed, there have been a surprising amount of close calls in this category. Since 1950, there have been 32 nuclear weapon accidents, known as broken arrows. A broken arrow is defined as an unexpected event involving nuclear weapons that results in the accidental launching, detonating, theft, or loss of the weapon. To date, 6 nuclear weapons have been lost and never recovered. There is too the famous 1983 case of Stanislav Petrov. 3 weeks after the Soviet military shot down a Korean airliner, Petrov was on duty at the Soviet nuclear early warning system. The system indicated that 5 nuclear missiles had been launched by the United States. Petrov believed this to be a false alarm, so he disobeyed Soviet protocol and direct orders, and he refused to launch a nuclear strike in retaliation. Indeed, he was correct. A later investigation proved that the Soviet system had simply malfunctioned. Through sheer personal judgment, Stanislav Petrov quite literally saved the world. In any of these scenarios, humanity got tremendously lucky. But should a weapon be fired erroneously, it is easy to imagine a country's leader not accepting it was an accident and retaliating. In the modern era, nuclear weapons can be produced at a range of sizes, so there exists a possibility of limited nuclear war, wherein two countries attack one another employing small weapons or limited targets. It would not be hard to imagine such a scenario escalating quickly to all-out war through misunderstandings, miscalculations, and human error. MAD also fails if a nuclear nation attacks a non-nuclear nation. Indeed, for a nuclear nation, this could be an appealing prospect. While such a strike would ignite a firestorm of international scandal, it would not necessarily guarantee nuclear retaliation. Most leaders would agree that a nuclear strike on a non-nuclear nation would be well outside the bounds of decency. But this is not a fail-safe. For one, such a thing as decency can hardly exist in the context of war. Additionally, as discussed, we cannot be guaranteed decency or rationality from any given world leader. Lastly, there is the issue of nuclear terrorism. Terrorist organizations across the world have expressed a desire for nuclear weapons. Furthermore, they have even made attempts to obtain nuclear materials. Acquiring such a weapon would be difficult for a terrorist organization. It is unlikely that any government would willingly provide a terrorist group with a nuclear weapon. But it is plausible for a terrorist group to steal a weapon. For example, Pakistan currently has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world. And of course, they are in an area which has a number of terrorist organizations and is often racked by government instability. The terrorist group could also obtain nuclear material and construct a crude weapon of their own. This would again be remarkably difficult, but there is a huge volume of fission material in the world, and managing its exchange has been an ongoing problem for world governments. Indeed, continued nuclear proliferation magnifies the danger of nuclear terrorism. If there are more bombs, there are more bombs for terrorists. Unfortunately, and with all of that said, the nuclear problem is one which is incredibly difficult to solve. This is in part because we have framed it entirely incorrectly. Nuclear weapons wear the disguise of war, but in truth they exist in a realm much more profound. Complete nuclear war does not just impose victory on an opponent, it annihilates the human race, probably for centuries and possibly forever. English philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "We do not want to look at this thing simply from the point of view of the next few years. We want to look at it from the point of view of the future of mankind. I do not think it is possible to exaggerate the gravity of the possibilities of evil that lie in the utilization of atomic energy. As I go about the streets and see St. Paul's, the British Museum, the Houses of Parliament, and the other monuments of our civilization, in my mind's eye I see a nightmare vision of those buildings as heaps of rubble with corpses all around them. That is a thing we have got to face, not only in our own country and cities, but throughout the civilized world." When nuclear weapons were first developed, many scientists and thinkers called for global disarmament. It is true that there are fewer nuclear weapons today than in decades past. But broadly, when prompted for disarmament, we have done the precise opposite. We have built nuclear armadas in the hopes of paralyzing ourselves. This paralysis is intended to stand between us and total annihilation. We believe that if everyone has a gun, no one will shoot. As Jonathan Schnell points out, this approach is very odd. Humans have hoped for so much and achieved so much. We have wanted to cure diseases and we have made medicine. We have wanted comfort and developed electricity. We have aimed to close distances and built airplanes, cars, and the internet. As humanity has developed grand desires, we have performed equally extraordinary deeds. But the hope for survival, like Schnell says, is the most modest one which can exist. In asking for survival, we do not even plead for comfort, happiness, or justice. We don't even ask for ourselves as individuals to continue. We ask instead for our species to survive, for the simple existence of other people. But in the face of this tiny desire, we have debased ourselves and we have eroded our self-esteem. It has become beyond us. We are too weak to guarantee the mere survival of humanity. We have decided that to satisfy this desire is utopian, unrealistic, and naive. We have declared that it is radical to ask that humanity be guaranteed a future. Instead, we have put a gun to the head of our collective existence and proclaimed there can be no other way. Albert Einstein once said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophes." The development of the nuclear bomb changed much more than the concept of war. It has fundamentally realigned the fate and existence of humanity. And yet we insist on handling these weapons as though they are relegated to the realm of warfare. Certainly, from such a wild disparity, we can only expect peril. One need not be omniscient to say that the risk of nuclear apocalypse, however low it is, will never be at zero while we have these weapons. Indeed, my feeling is that humanity cannot be safe as long as nuclear bombs exist, and they do now exist, probably in a very permanent capacity. I think that the modern media landscape has conditioned people to expect answers and solutions from videos like this one. But in truth, I am just a writer with a YouTube channel. In a million years, I could never solve the issue of nuclear proliferation. I do not have the wisdom or scientific or geopolitical knowledge to proclaim any perfect solutions. However, I think the very first step towards answering a question is asking it in an honest and open way. I believe the creation of nuclear bombs was humanity's greatest and most serious misstep. We have now entered a game which can have no winners. There's just no going back. My hope is that humanity can learn from this and in the future more carefully consider what so-called developments we endeavor to produce.